Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley McManus, Director of Marketing at Affectiva. Welcome to Affectiva Asks, a human perception AI podcast, where each episode we will interview a thought leader doing cutting-edge work in the AI space. A little bit about us. Affectiva is the pioneer of human perception AI, a software that can detect nuanced human emotions, complex cognitive states, behaviors, activities, and interactions. And Affectiva is applying this technology to advance the next generation of multimodal in-cabin sensing. Today's episode features Affectiva's co-founder and CEO, Dr. Rana el Kaliouby, interviewing Karl Iagnemma, President of Autonomous Mobility at Aptiv. During their interview, he talks to us a bit about his background, his early work with nuTonomy, which has since been acquired by Aptiv, and how autonomous vehicle technology will transform the future of transportation and mobility.
Hi everyone, I'm Rana el Kaliouby, Affectiva's co-founder and CEO. Today I'm interviewing Karl Iagnemma, who is the president of Autonomous Mobility at Aptiv. He was previously the CEO and co-founder of nuTonomy, which was acquired by Aptiv. Thank you, Karl, for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you have a really fascinating background going from academia at MIT to starting nuTonomy to getting acquired by Aptiv. So tell us about your career trajectory.
Yeah, well, I'll go further back if you don't mind. I grew up in the Detroit area, and so cars, was kind of my DNA. My father worked in the automotive industry. He was an engineer. He's now retired. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, I did an internship at General Motors to see what the industry was like. So this was now early 90s. And I would say at that time, the auto industry was not the place to be if you wanted to develop new technology. I left that internship and I thought, I'm not going to work in the auto industry. This isn't for me. So I went to MIT and I started studying robotics. But a funny thing happened. The robots I was building were robots that had four wheels and rolled around. And at the beginning of my research, they were small. You could hold them in two hands, but they started to get bigger and bigger. And at some point I realized that all the technology I was developing for mobile robots was the same technology that could be applied to intelligent vehicles or driver assistance systems and eventually fully autonomous vehicles. So in 2013, together with a colleague at MIT, Emilio Frizzoli, we launched nuTonomy, which was a startup that was focused on building the software for fully autonomous vehicles. And we decided to make things as difficult as possible on ourselves, I guess. We launched simultaneously in Cambridge, Mass. And in Singapore. We decided those would be the right places to be early adopters for autonomous vehicles. We grew the company to about 120 people from 2013 to 2017. In 2017, we joined Aptiv, which is an automotive tier one supplier. And we've been growing ever since within Aptiv, but still focused on the same mission of developing software and technology for fully autonomous vehicles.
Why Singapore?
So Singapore is, Singapore is what I would call an early adopter city. They are real believers in the power of autonomous technology to improve the transportation landscape for their citizens, to make the streets safer, but also more efficient. Singapore is a small place. Mm-hmm. It's an island. Its population is expected to grow significantly over the next 20 years, but they don't want to build many more roads. So how do you move more people around the same road network? Well, you do it by becoming more efficient. And one of the early studies that my co-founder did, now this is as an academic, so an academic study, but using real data, he studied the potential impact of autonomous technology on transportation efficiency. And he found that if you replace all the personally owned vehicles in Singapore, this is about 850,000 cars, if you replace them with autonomous vehicles and use them in a shared fashion, you could replace those 800 and some thousand vehicles with 300,000 autonomous vehicles and meet people's transportation needs. So I think the government of Singapore saw this study and got excited. They said, well, wow, this is a radical way to improve efficiency on our roads. And they've been proponents of autonomous technology ever since.
So you have some kind of test fleets or development fleets on the road, both in Boston and in Singapore, and in other cities around the world as well. Can you comment on that?
And we test our cars every day in Boston, in Pittsburgh, in Las Vegas, and in Singapore. It's the same software running in these four different cities. And if you think about those cities, very different driving environments. In Boston, we have an old, by U.S. standards, road network. We have snow. We have all the weather. In Vegas, kind of wider boulevards. We get dust storms in Las Vegas, but generally speaking, good weather. And then in Singapore, instead of driving on the right side of the road, we're driving on the left side of the road. Right. We have a fairly dense traffic environment. So we expose our cars and kind of stress test our cars in a wide variety of driving conditions. That's actually extremely helpful as technology developers because we very quickly understand where the cars have trouble, where they have challenges. And then through feedback, by developing advancements on the technology and then sending it out into the road again, we improve our technology very quickly.
So what's the biggest challenge that you're facing right now in developing, or the software faces right now?
Yeah, but, there's really, I would say, two major challenges, broadly speaking, associated with autonomous driving. One is perception. It's helping the car look out around itself and really comprehend the surroundings. So to put together a picture of the world from all its various sensors. And in our car, we have a couple dozen sensors. You got to stitch all that together and then also make some interpretation. Say, here's a person, here's a vehicle, here's a cyclist, and here's what I think they might do next. Because we as human drivers are very good at predicting what other actors on the road are going to do next. So that's the perception problem, and it's just computationally very complex. It relies heavily on cutting-edge AI, which I know, of course, is one of Affectiva's strong interests and areas of expertise. And so, but it remains very difficult. Now, the other area that's very hard for autonomous vehicles today is what we call the decision-making or the policy problem. And that is deciding what the car should do next, what the autonomous vehicle should do next. And of course, it's in reaction to not only the cars around it, the vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists around it, but the rules of the road and any kind of driving preferences or norms in any particular city you might be in. And of course, we as humans have the advantage of being able to use our brain and use memory and synthesize various inputs to make a right decision. From a technology perspective, again, we rely on artificial intelligence. At Aptiv, we rely on a technology called structured AI to make the right decision on the road.
What is structured AI?
So structured AI is Aptiv's approach to solving this decision-making problem, this policy problem. It's really an approach that is philosophically somewhat similar to how we as humans learn how to drive. As humans, we don't learn how to drive by having a rigid set of rules we try to follow in every circumstance. We start from first principles. We learn the rules of the road by reading a driver's manual. And there's actually not that many rules of the road. There's principles of speed limits, of yielding, stop signs, etc. But it's how you apply them that's hard. So putting them in context. So our technology, structured AI, which is something we've developed uniquely at Aptiv, basically allows us to go from rules to application in any wide variety of complex scenarios. It's what makes our cars, as safe and smart as they are.
Can you comment, this is a public debate on the timeline for rolling out these vehicles. What's your view on when we're going to actually see a lot more of these vehicles on the road?
Yeah, that's a question I get asked a lot because, I think as an industry, there's a lot of excitement around autonomous vehicles because of all the promise of the technology. So I think, in the early days of development, there was maybe, on the media side, on some of the early developer side, there was optimism around when we were going to deploy these systems at scale. And then, of course, we started getting into development and understood some of the real technical challenges associated with some of these hard problems we just talked about, perception, policy, decision-making. And so now I think reality has set in. People understand what's in front of them. I think we have a very much clearer sense of when this technology is going to hit the road. I'll tell you, we're on the road today. You can experience a driverless car today. If you go to Las Vegas, you can hail one of our cars. We've given over 50,000 rides to members of the public over the last year on the Lyft network. So it's just through your standard Lyft app. Now, we've still got what we call safety drivers in the car behind the wheel, but most of the time they're not even touching the wheel. They're just there to monitor the system in case anything unexpected happens. But 2020 is when we expect to have our first truly driverless systems. Now, they'll be operating in a very constrained environment, as we call it. So the narrow operating domain. They won't be picking up and dropping off paying customers on the Las Vegas Strip. It'll be a much simpler driving environment, but we'll expand that driving environment over time. So for us at Aptiv, 2022 is when we envision we'll be actually picking up and dropping off paying customers with a truly driverless car, no one behind the wheel. Now, 2022, again, we'll be operating in certain cities in that fashion. It won't be the case that any listener to this podcast will be able to hail a car, walk out to the front of their house in any city around the world, and
will I be able to put my 10-year-old have a car pick him up from school and take him to a squash practice?
So again, it depends where you are.
Right.
There will be those early adopter cities, those initial cities that have the right ingredients for driverless cars. Good weather, good driving conditions, the support of the local government. That's where you'll be able to ride in a driverless car in the early to middle part of this century. And in other cities, it'll take a little bit more time.
What is the role of data in kind of training these systems and exposing them to a wide range of scenarios?
So we rely, extremely heavily on data to improve our technology. First of all, we look at what the car sees, the decisions that it makes based on that data that it collects, and we, through feedback, retrain our systems and improve our systems every day. So I can tell you that a significant part of our budget, in fact, is allocated toward collecting data, transmitting data, and storing data. So there's a technical dimension of it. There's also what I would call the non-technical part of it. We collect a lot of data around the user experience. How do people feel when they're in our cars? What's their feedback at the end of a trip? When we drop them off after giving them a ride in Las Vegas, what did they think of the trip?
What do they think?
Well, today, they seem to like it. We get a star rating at the end of every trip.
Yeah.
Again, it's with Lyft. So, just when you take a normal Lyft ride, you've got to give a rating at the end, 1 star through 5. Our star rating today is 4.95 out of 5, over, again, more than 50,000 trips. So we're very proud of that. But for the rides that are less than 5 stars, we want to know why. And so, the reason I bring this up is because although driverless technology is an incredibly hard technical problem, an extremely interesting one for the engineer in me, it also has this societal dimension that really can't be overlooked. We could develop a technology that's a radical breakthrough, but if society is not ready for it, and if we haven't really created a great product, then people won't use it. We won't realize the benefits of driverless technology, and that'll be a great shame.
That's a great segue to kind of the tie-in with Affectiva's work and mission. As you know, we're on this mission to humanize technology. We're very kind of focused on building human-centric AI. You've talked a lot about how it's really critical to think through the experience of riding in these vehicles. So can you comment on how you think about that? I know I've heard you before talk about shared mental models with these vehicles. So
I'll tell you, based on our experience, we think that the experience in the car, again, not just the technology, but the ride experience, is really the determining factor around whether this technology will ever be widely used by society. And so to us, that means a few things. We realize that it's not just enough to have a technology that's safe, it has to be also comfortable. So when a passenger is riding in one of our cars in Las Vegas, they have to not only experience a safe trip, but also have the perception that the trip is safe, really feel confidence in the technology. And one of the ways that we try to do this is by creating what we call this shared mental model that you just mentioned, Rana. It's by displaying the right information at the right time to the passenger in the back seat so that they can understand what the car is thinking, if you will. So let's think of an example where the car maybe has to make a swerve within the lane. And the person in the back seat, the rider, may wonder what the heck just happened. We want to make sure we can explain to them why the car did what it did. It swerved, for example, to avoid an obstacle in the road or an animal that had run out into the road. It's a big difference from a rider's perspective in having that understanding and being able to have that confidence in the technology. But human-centric AI to me also is about personalization. And automotive technology is no different than really any other form of technology in that it's becoming much more personalized. It used to be that you bought a Chevy, your neighbor bought a Chevy. It was the same car. You didn't have a choice. It did the same thing, no matter who the passenger, the occupants, the driver was. The expectation for the future will be that your car adapts to you, learns how you drive, your preferences for the cabin, for comfort, for any kind of entertainment. I mean, that'll be table stakes. And so being able to capture that information in an efficient way and really create the personal experience will be one of the next frontiers in automotive.
Are you kind of exploring the frontier, the next frontier around some of this personalization and monetization at Aptiv?
Well, we're learning. I would put it that way. We're early in our journey in that dimension. I think it's incredibly exciting. A lot of that data that we just talked about data, but that data is actually very difficult to get. It's rare data. It's data that comes by, having a fleet of autonomous vehicles on the road. There's few companies today that can claim to have an operating autonomous mobility service on the road. We're very proud to be one of the very few. Those 50,000 trips that I mentioned, there's not a lot of data like that in the world. I'd love it if it were 500,000 trips. So with every ride we give, we learn a little bit more.
All right, so let's assume that this all works out and we've got, autonomous vehicles on the road. How do you think that transforms transportation and mobility in the future?
I think there's a number of huge benefits that'll come for autonomy in the future. The first is road safety. 94% by certain studies of accidents are caused by human error. And autonomous technology promises to radically reduce that number. Autonomous vehicles are never drunk. They're never distracted by looking at their phones. They're never drowsy. And so the potential for increase in road safety is just tremendous. So that's the first dimension. The second is really around transportation efficiency. When you have a fleet of autonomous vehicles on the road, the great benefit is that you can coordinate the activity of that fleet. You can basically try to align the activity of the fleet with the capacity of the road network. Another way to put it is, instead of everybody going to the same place at the same time, you can distribute those cars more efficiently over the capacity of the road network. And so we expect that there'll be a significant gain in transport efficiency. And then, third, really it's about accessibility. Autonomous transportation promises to dramatically reduce the cost of transportation. And so if you're an individual who needs to get to work, needs to get to your employer, and that difference of $1.50 a mile or 75 cents a mile is the difference of you being able to get to work or not, well, we see autonomy as being able to enable those individuals to earn a living. So really, you put these things together, I think it's very rare that you find a single technology that can have such a dramatic impact across so many different factors that are so important to society.
Again, what are the closest examples of how this will transform, for example, what we do in these vehicles, right? Like right now, when you're in a vehicle, your time's tied up driving most of the time. When you're suddenly now always a rider, like, can you kind of reimagine what the experience will be like?
Yeah, we use mobility services today. Obviously, there's Uber, there's Lyft, there's taxis, but much of the time we're driving. We're driving in single occupancy vehicles. So it's the potential to reclaim that time and then do with it whatever we like. I think it'll be a shame if it means we're all working much longer hours every day and turning it only into productivity. But whether it's productivity or entertainment or,
wellness,
additional rest, health and wellness, there's really almost...
Or shopping.
Or shopping, sure. But there's nothing more valuable we can return to individuals than time, especially in this day and age. So that's, far and away the biggest impact at a personal level that we see for autonomous vehicles. And the economics as well. I mean, if we look at the economic impact of autonomous vehicles on safety, on efficiency, they're enormous, but they all pale compared to the economic impact of returning, 2 times 40 minutes per day, the average commute, let's say 80 minutes to however many hundreds of millions of individuals are potentially benefiting from AV technology worldwide. on a daily basis.
So some of what's happening in the automotive industry kind of is mirroring what's happened in the aviation industry many years ago. Can you comment on that? Are there any lessons learned or best practices that we can take from the aviation space?
We're learning a lot from the aviation space, in particular around developing highly complex systems that are safe. And if you think about a modern airplane, a modern airplane has an immensely sophisticated control system, both mechanical and software-based. It also has backup systems that function if that primary system fails. You think as a passenger in an aircraft, okay, that's good to know. You definitely want that. You want to have as many redundant backup systems as you can. For passenger vehicles, for cars, traditionally, the human driver has been the backup system. So if there's some mechanical failure in the car, there's always a person behind the wheel to step on the brakes. Now, when we think about driverless vehicles, that person behind the wheel may not be there, or they may not be attentive, they may be sleeping. And that means we have to develop our own new redundant safety system technology. And that's been a very new experience and really a significant challenge for us in the autonomous vehicle industry. We've learned a lot from the aerospace industry on how they design, how they certify these systems, how they think about potentially regulating them. And it's really not a stretch to say that autonomous vehicles in the future, we will share a lot of DNA with modern aircraft.
And what is the role of regulation in all of this?
Well, it depends on where you are. So I'll tell you that depending on which country you're in around the world, and even which city you're in a particular country, the regulatory landscape may be quite different. We do a lot of driving in the U.S. In the U.S., there is today not a uniform, let's say, federally mandated regulatory landscape. In fact, it's much more of a patchwork of regulation, depending on the state you're in. Certain states have a very laissez-faire attitude toward autonomous driving technology. Other states have, let's say, more strict guidelines around, for example, what it takes to test AVs on public roads. Now, other countries, Singapore is a good example of another country where we do testing, and they have, again, their own uniquely defined and I would say fairly rigorous set of standards around testing autonomous vehicles and eventually operating autonomous mobility services. So for us as developers, certainly we'd love it if every country in the world had their identical rules for autonomous vehicle development, but we know that that's not realistic, at least not in the near term. So we work closely with the local stakeholders, the regulatory agencies, the governmental agencies, the technology and policy developers. We work with them in every city that we're in to ensure that we've got a productive relationship, that they know how we operate, that nobody will be surprised by any new developments, that we have a clear understanding of what will happen, for example, if there's a crash, an accident on the road. All these dialogues are very important to have. So really it's a case-by-case basis, a city-by-city undertaking at the moment.
That's so fascinating. Does that trickle down to the level of the software? Like these different regulations per state or per country?
To a certain extent it does. For example, one of the regulations may be in a particular city around auditability or access to data. And so that may actually dictate how you develop software, from a strategic perspective. If you are required by regulation, by law, to be able to explain the decisions that your car made on the road, that may rule out some potential approaches. And of course, data collection and being able to present data in the event of a crash, of course, would have some impact on our technology development strategy. So, certainly, the way we develop our tech is in some degree a response to the regulatory landscape.
So I want to go back to your career trajectory, going from academia to startup to now being part of a big public company. How did your role differ in each of these stages? And do you have any advice for listeners who aspire to kind of follow a similar trajectory?
Yeah, that's a great question. Going from academia to a startup was, I think, less of a leap than people may expect. And I think it's in part because people underappreciate the role of fundraising in modern academia. As an academic, I was obviously sitting in a room, thinking about hard problems and writing research papers and all the rest. I was also about raising money. I spent a lot of my time trying to convince sponsors to support my research with grants. When you go out and start a company, you've got to hire people, you've got to put in HR policies in place, and all the rest. You've also got to raise a lot of money. You've got to keep the lights on. And so that step was not, didn't make me nervous at all. And so that was a fairly natural transition. Now, the academic labs that I ran at MIT were at most, let's say, 20 people. nuTonomy, we quickly grew past 20 and then 30, 40, up to 100 plus. And so the evolution of the business in terms of scale was certainly something I had to learn how to adapt to and understand how to be a leader of a business, a manager. All those were skills that I had to learn, which I found extremely interesting. Moving from a startup to a larger corporate environment, that's also been a big learning curve for me. It's been super interesting to be part of Aptiv. Aptiv is 150,000 plus people in more than 50 countries around the world.
And what's your role exactly? Can you define your role?
Sure. So I'm the president of our autonomous mobility business within Aptiv. So my team is about 700 people, but within this much larger corporate entity. And there's huge advantages to being within a larger entity. You have to learn how to take advantage of them, but they're there. You've got experts all over the world who know things about building technology in the cars, about developing safe automotive technology to really automotive standard, if you will. But again, a very different landscape. So it's been a really exciting few phases, but certainly the transition from academia to startup, that to me was very natural. The transition from startup to large corporation, that was more of a bit of a learning curve, but I've learned a lot. It's been super exciting over the last year and a half.
So advice to our listeners.
Advice to our aspiring startup founders?
Yes.
What I found was I don't consider myself a natural entrepreneur. I was very interested in the technology, in the research, and it was only when I convinced myself that there was no way I could do the work within the university environment, within MIT. I thought, I can't do what I want to do in this environment anymore. I have to go out and start this company. To me, that felt right. It was this notion of having to start the company.
A conviction.
That was the only way to do it. Right. I felt like that was the moment that, the only way that I would start a company. I read about other entrepreneurs who say, I went through 7 or 8 ideas and started companies ranging from, pet supplies to AI development. That was never me. And that worked for me. It meant that I really felt that I was doing my life's work. I'd been doing it my entire career, so I knew everybody in the business and I knew the technology inside and out, and I found that to be incredibly helpful. I think that's pretty obvious. And it was also a lot of fun. I was at the stage of my life, I was in my early 40s, where I was ready to do something new. I was ready for a bit of a change. I think my wife thought I was a little crazy, because usually you don't do that sort of change when you got 2 young kids at home. But, I was reasonably confident as well that we were onto something good. So it was a great experience. Even if I would say our outcome I view as a success story, I was very happy to join Aptiv. Even if it hadn't been, it would have been an incredibly valuable experience from a learning perspective. And so I wouldn't have regretted it a bit if things hadn't worked out as they did. But where we are today, with Aptiv and growing our team and having 100 plus vehicles on the road and letting people experience the technology in Vegas, I really couldn't be happier.
And really being on the forefront of turning this into, from vision to reality.
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, the impact, all these things I talked about, I think it's easy to say, it's almost impossible to really appreciate. But 40,000 plus people dying on the road in the U.S. every year. And it's about the same number of women that die every year from breast cancer in the U.S. I mean, we were sitting here talking about having line of sight to a cure for breast cancer. People would be talking about Nobel Prizes. They would say, well, this is unbelievable. I really believe that the impact of autonomous technology it's that same order of magnitude.
Absolutely.
And even if things, let's say, are a little bit slower, if they don't evolve the way we anticipate, if things, for whatever reason, technical, societal, or otherwise, we run into headwinds, this technology that we're developing will make cars safer. It'll trickle down to driver assistance technology, to the safety systems in your car. So cars on the road 10 years from now, even if they're not fully autonomous, will be partly autonomous. They will help you be a better driver, and they will save a lot of lives.
Can you share with our listeners what was your experience being at the summit, and would you recommend that people attend?
Yeah, I can definitely recommend it. Automotive technology and AI are coming together at a really fast rate. And so what was great about the summit was to get individuals in the room who were domain experts from both sides, but maybe didn't have a lot of crossover experience. In some cases, there were certainly some individuals who did, but it was bringing together these two communities. And it's exciting because I think we're just scratching the surface around understanding what's possible when we apply AI and kind of human-centric AI to the passenger vehicle. I mentioned earlier, but I think one of the really exciting things is exploring what's possible around personalization of the ride experience. I think that's going to be incredibly powerful. Obviously, Affectiva's technology is a great example of how we can use AI to understand emotion, and the applications in the vehicle for that I think there's many. And so I think we're going to start to see AI technology coming into automotive features very, very soon. So, these conferences are coming just in time.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll see you there.
I hope so.
So one question we ask of all our guests: if your car could do one thing in the future to make your life just a little easier, what would it be?
Well, it would drive itself.
Of course.
But it would also be completely safe. It would eliminate what we've all experienced, either in our families or our close friends or our loved one, which is someone being in a serious automotive accident. That would be a thing of the past.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. This was fascinating. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Rana.
Some stats that Karl quoted that struck me in particular were that in 2018, over 40,000 people died on American roads, which is almost about the same number of women that die every year from breast cancer in the U.S. He also quoted studies of accidents asserting that 94% of accidents are caused by human error. His point that autonomous vehicles are never drunk, distracted by looking at their phones, or drowsy does highlight the potential for increasing road safety through technology, and it could be parallel to having line of sight to a cure for breast cancer. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Remember to subscribe to Affectiva's Human Perception AI podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes. We're also on social media, so please reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram at Affectiva to share any feedback you have on the show and weigh in on discussion using hashtag #AffectivaPodcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.